The exhausting production experience of 1960's Spartacus left its young director, Stanley Kubrick, in a state of profound disenchantment. He found that he could not peacefully work within the rigid demands and expectations of the American studio system, a fundamental problem for an artist who simultaneously values complete control while aspiring to direct large-scale Hollywood films. After some deep reflection, Kubrick found that the answer to his malaise didn't lie in his native United States whatsoever. It laid across the Atlantic, in Europe, where a new wave of filmmakers were enjoying total artistic autonomy and, as a result, creating radical, groundbreaking films. Kubrick only made 2 outright comedies in his career, Lolita and its 1964 follow-up, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and it's worth noting that both films are decidedly dark in their comic sensibilities. As an artist, Kubrick valued pitch-black irony, and both Lolita and Dr. Strangelove are absolutely dripping with them. Made close together, chronologically speaking, and under similar conditions, Lolita and Dr. Strangelove exist as companion pieces, complementary to each other in surprising ways. Kubrick's artistic explorations throughout his career can be charted according to the opposing poles of sex and violence. Lolita is ostensibly a film about sex, the ultimate act of creation, whereas Dr. Strangelove is a film about war, the ultimate act of destruction. Their shared comic affectations and visual style bind them together, giving us perhaps the most straightforward insight into Kubrick's artistic profile before he would obscure it with the expressionistic experimental works of his later career. In looking for his follow-up to Spartacus, Kubrick and his producing partner James B. Harris settled on Vladimir Nabokov's controversial novel Lolita, about a well-read college professor and his torrid relationship with his teenage stepdaughter. In tackling such extremely sensitive subject matter, Kubrick must have known that he was making a controversial film. But what he couldn't have anticipated was just how much he would have to compromise his vision to even get it released. They hired Nabokov himself to adapt the novel into a screenplay, and set up their production camp in England, far away from the watchful eye of the American studio system.
I shall be moving on. I must prepare for my work at Beardsley College in the fall.
And I guess this is goodbye.
Yes.
Lolita is admittedly stuffed with truly reprehensible characters possessing significant moral shortcomings. It's a credit to the cast's talents and Kubrick's eye for performance that they end up coming across as undeniably charismatic and, dare I say, relatable.
You just touch me and I go as limp as a noodle. It scares me.
Yes, I know the feeling. It was the divine Edgar.
Who's the divine Edgar? Edgar who?
Edgar Allan Poe, of course.
James Mason gives the central character of Professor Humbert Humbert a set of urbane, sophisticated sensibilities that appeal to the audience in a reassuring paternal fashion, making it easier to forgive his monstrous qualities while simultaneously making us complicit in them.
Go on. Get out of my way. I'm leaving here today. You can have all of it. But you are never going to see that miserable brat again!
Shelley Winters plays Humbert's wife, the widow Charlotte Hayes, as a vain, aging beauty so desperate for love and companionship that she flaunts her insecurities in loud, tacky clothing and clingy, dependent behavior.
You know, I've missed you terribly.
I haven't missed you. In fact, I've been revoltingly unfaithful to you.
Sue Lyon imbues the titular role of Lolita with a bored, sultry affectation and wisdom beyond her years. With her calculated manipulation of Humbert's emotions, she's every bit as deceitful and mischievous as her elders, if not more so.
Gee. Right in the boxing glove.
Legendary character actor Peter Sellers, who pioneered the idea of disguising oneself in multiple personas in a single project, plays the avant-garde playwright and aristocratic hedonist Claire Quilty, reflecting the shifting mores and liberal attitudes that shaped the counterculture of the 1960s.
We are wondering, has anybody instructed Lolita in the facts of life?
The facts?
The facts of life. Well, Dr. Humberts, to you, she's still the little girl what is cradled in the arms. But to those boys over there at Beardsley High, she is a lovely girl, you know, with the swing, you know, the jazz, and she has got a curvatures which I take a lot of notice of.
Acting as a foil for Humbert in their mutual pursuit of Lolita's affection, Sellers' irreverent performance extends all the way to his peculiar dialect and manner of speech, which he reportedly modeled after Kubrick's own.
May I say one other thing to you? It was really on my mind. I've been thinking about it quite a lot. I noticed when you was checking in, you had a lovely, pretty little girl with you. She was really lovely. As a matter of fact, she wasn't so little, come to think of it. She was a fairly tall little, well, I mean, taller than little, you know what I mean? But she was really lovely. I wish I had a lovely, pretty, tall, lovely little girl like that. I mean,
Well, that was my daughter.
Your daughter? Gee, isn't it great to have a lovely, tall, pretty, little, small daughter like that? It's really wonderful.
Shot by cinematographer Oswald Morris, Lolita marks Kubrick's return to the black and white 35mm film format. Oswald and Kubrick enriched the image with a high-contrast, polished look that belies the film's independent pedigree. While the visual presentation itself is relatively minimist and sedate, Kubrick's impeccable eye for composition graces his frames with compelling depth and meaning.
Let us take him to the Dark Kingdom. Yes. To the Dark Kingdom. Away! Away!
The camera work is low-key and subtle, favoring graceful dolly and crane movements that don't call attention to their inherent complexity.
Is it my fault if I feel young?
For instance, Kubrick built the Hayes house set in such a way that he could dolly and crane through floors and walls to establish a sense of spatial continuity. This technique can be seen in many modern films, especially in those of Kubrick acolyte David Fincher, who used his 2002 feature Panic Room to build upon Kubrick's foundations with similar, yet highly stylized and exaggerated camera movements. Funnily enough, this is not the only cue that Fincher took from Lolita. The film's poster tagline, "How did they ever make a movie of Lolita?" would be repurposed by Fincher for the 21st century in the advertising for The Social Network. Kubrick completes the tone of his acerbic, pitch-black comedy by incorporating the music of Nelson Riddle, who trivializes the character's sordid actions with a light-hearted, bouncy jazz score that also incorporates a playful samba theme for Lolita, an apt musical reflection of Lolita's dual nature as both innocent and seductress.
When I stood Adam naked, oh, Adam naked, you should be ashamed of yourself, Captain.
The film's winking tone is absolutely a product of its time, a necessity of its making under the oppressively restrictive Hays Code and the stern, watchful eye of the Catholic Legion of Decency.
41, 42, 43.
Mr. Swain, what does an actor manager do with his spare time in a small town like this?
Oh, I swim, play tennis, lift weights. Gets rid of the excess energy. What do you do with your excess energy?
Well, we do a lot of things with my excess energy. I tell you, one of the things we do a lot of, that's judo. Did you ever hear about that?
The playful skirting around of abject indecency with thinly veiled double entendres and innuendo is directly responsible for Lolita's charm, and allows Kubrick to explore complicated sexual ideas from a space of relative social safety.
Humbert, when you get to know me better, you'll find I'm extremely broad-minded.
Sure.
In fact, John and I, we're both broad-minded.
By highlighting sexual deviancy and quirkiness within otherwise well-adjusted people, Lolita predicts the sexual revolution of the late 1960s, incorporating barely disguised references to swingers and pornography.
And he promised to get me a studio contract. But it never turned out that way, and instead he wanted me to cooperate with the others, making some kind of a, an art movie.
An art movie?
At other times, Kubrick doesn't even bother to hide the innuendo. Lolita affords ample opportunity for Kubrick to explore other thematic and aesthetic fascinations. His love for one-point perspective framing results in a recurring shot that follows Humbert's car as it drives away from us en route to Quilty's house, full of purposeful malice. The climactic murder of Quilty is staged in an artful manner that stays consistent with Kubrick's artful depictions of violence. Instead of directly showing Humbert shoot Quilty to death, Kubrick stages their actions so that Quilty first crawls behind the meager cover of a painting depicting a Victorian-era woman, with the bullet tearing a hole into her cheek and presumably continuing along its trajectory into Quilty's body. Lolita's Baroque imagery, evident in both the Victorian portrait as well as the opulent mansion that surrounds it, calls to mind similar occurrences throughout Kubrick's career, notably Barry Lyndon and Eyes Wide Shut. Additionally, his usual depiction of the bourgeoisie, aristocrats waltzing in ballrooms to classical music, receives a modern American twist on Lolita in the form of a high school dance. Lolita found commercial and critical success when it was released in 1962, but more importantly, it marks the beginning of Kubrick's reputation as provocateur and subverter of genre. The second half of the 20th century was marked by a profound existential malaise brought about by the rise of the atomic bomb and its ability to throw the world into a nuclear holocaust at the drop of a hat. The Cold War transcended conventional notions of armed conflict and became a permanent state of tension and caution, where the slightest miscommunication could set off the end of the world as we knew it. When faced with such a morbid, seemingly hopeless existence, what can one do but simply laugh at the absurdity of it all? Enter Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, released during the height of nuclear escalation in 1964, and arguably one of the most defining films of the 20th century.
General Turgidson, I find this very difficult to understand. I was under the impression that I was the only one in authority to order the use of nuclear weapons.
That's right, sir. You are the only person authorized to do so. And although I hate to judge before all the facts are in, it's beginning to look like General Ripper exceeded his authority.
Kubrick was fascinated with the idea of mankind acting as the agent of our own demise through nuclear warfare. Ever the dutiful researcher, he read everything he could find on the subject, eventually finding a story he wanted to tell in Peter George's cautionary novel Red Alert. In securing the film rights, Kubrick and Harris initially planned to create a straight adaptation of George's thriller. However, Harris was at this time beginning to aspire to a directing career of his own, and he amicably ended his partnership with Kubrick during pre-production. Left to his own devices, Kubrick started toying with the idea of transforming the film into a black comedy, finding that acknowledging the utter absurdity inherent in voluntary nuclear warfare actually enhanced the effectiveness of his message. Towards this end, Kubrick brought in noted playwright Terry Southern to fashion his script into satire, in the process creating the eccentric titular character of Dr. Strangelove and giving the film its absurdly long name. Dr. Strangelove boasts one of the most eclectic and talented casts to ever assemble under Kubrick's supervision. Peter Sellers headlines the film in multiple roles, a development caused by studio mandate. Columbia Pictures, rightly or wrongly, attributed the success of Lolita to Sellers playing multiple roles, and decreed Sellers do the same in Dr. Strangelove as a contingent of their financing the film.
It looks like we're in a shooting war.
Oh, hell.
As RAF Captain Mandrake, Sellers channels the requisite fussy airs of a British serviceman, a strained politeness that makes his struggle to avert nuclear holocaust an exercise in absurdity.
No, I'm perfectly serious, operator. The President, yes, the President of the United States. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't got enough change. Could you make this a collect call, operator?
He also plays United States President Merkin Muffley, basing his physicality off the self-serious affectations of presidential aspirant Adlai Stevenson.
Now then, Dimitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb.
However, both characters can't help but be overshadowed by the eccentric mad scientist Dr. Strangelove, who is modeled in the grand tradition of German expressionist cinema. While Sellers would never collaborate again with Kubrick, his work here serves as a fitting send-off to their fruitful partnership.
Also, when they go down into the mine, everyone will still be alive. There will be no shocking memories, and the prevailing motion will be one of nostalgia for those left behind, combined with a spirit of bold curiosity for the adventure ahead. Ha!
To fill out the rest of his mostly male ensemble, Kubrick turned to actors both old and new. After their successful collaboration in 1956's The Killing, Kubrick was able to lead Sterling Hayden out of retirement to play General Jack Ripper, an all-around alpha male typical of the mid-century military-industrial complex, who suddenly goes rogue and orders a nuclear attack so that the Russians won't steal their precious bodily fluids.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Venerated character actor George C. Scott plays the ornery, blustering role of General Buck Turgidson, a man who is so eager to attack the Russians that he dismisses the massive American casualties such an act would create as a small price to pay for ensuring his beloved country's dominance.
If the pilot's good, see? I mean, if he's really sharp, he can barrel that baby in so low. I mean, you ought to see it sometime. It's a sight. A big plane like a 52. Vroom! It's jet exhaust frying chickens in the barnyard.
Yeah, but has he got a chance?
Has he got a chance? Yeah, well, you...
Look, boys, I ain't much of a hand at making speeches. But I got a pretty fair idea that something doggone important's going on back there.
American actor Slim Pickens plays the role of Major Kong, the pilot of the B-52 speeding towards Russia with its fateful payload. James Earl Jones also appears in the small role of Lieutenant Zog, one of Kong's bombardiers, and the only man on the B-52 to question the validity of their command. Kubrick's films are normally praised more for their technical proficiency than their acting, but Dr. Strangelove's cast more than holds its own against Kubrick's considerable visual flair, bringing it all home with a manic energy unparalleled in even most screwball comedies. The cinematography of Dr. Strangelove finds Kubrick in a transitory phase of his visual style. His aesthetic arguably serves as a bridge between the polished glamour of old Hollywood filmmaking and the rough edges of the new wave, with Dr. Strangelove in a sense becoming a bridge inside of that bridge. While Kubrick and cinematographer Gilbert Taylor shoot Dr. Strangelove on black and white 35mm film and give it a relatively straightforward, polished presentation, the Maverick director peppers the film with experimental, cutting-edge touches, like rack zooms that highlight information inside the B-52 plane, or the chaotic, handheld cinema verite rendering of the Air Force base battle, which predated the style popularized by Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan by nearly 34 years. When working inside a studio set environment, Kubrick favors high-contrast, low-key lighting and compositions that favor depth and minimal camera movement. The striking visual presentation, however, owes less to the cinematography and more to the iconic set design by legendary production designer Ken Adam. Famous for his larger-than-life supervillain lair sets on the James Bond series, Adam proves to be an inspired choice to realize Kubrick's outsized vision of absurd grandiosity. He echoes Kubrick's propensity for depth, designing hard, angular sets like the War Room and General Ripper's office with strong lines that converge onto a singular point. The War Room in particular is an unassailable icon of set design, perfectly reinforcing the character's delusions of grandeur, and in the process becoming one of the most recognizable sets in cinematic history.
20 minutes. You listen to that. Chock block police stations, all churning it out.
Mandrake?
Yes, sir?
I thought I issued instructions for all radios on this base to be impounded.
The idea of Dr. Strangelove as a transitory film in Kubrick's filmography also extends to his treatment of music. While Laurie Johnson is credited as the film's composer, the majority of the music stems from either pre-recorded material or adaptations of pre-existing material. What original score appears does so mainly during the B-52 bomber sequences, but even then it is an appropriation of pre-existing material. The military hymn, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, is rendered in a mix of snare drums, trumpets, and men humming in low unison that suggests the steady, unstoppable encroach of war. Kubrick's mischievous nature also results in bookending Dr. Strangelove with a pair of cheeky pop songs that make ironic counterpoints to the images they accompany. An instrumental cover of Try a Little Tenderness opens the film under stock footage of jet fighters refueling in mid-air, further emphasizing the sexualized nature of the process while also foreshadowing one of the film's key themes, the idea of sex as a fundamental motivator behind conflict. Kubrick then closes Dr. Strangelove with the mother of all showstoppers, a cataclysmic nuclear war set to Vera Lynn's romantic ballad We'll Meet Again.
We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but...
Only a sense of humor as perverse as Kubrick's could have thought of this juxtaposition of sound and image, and he found it so effective that he would continue to break new ground with this technique for decades to come. While Kubrick never really established a highly identifiable visual style for himself like, say, David Fincher or Wes Anderson, he nonetheless managed to make his stamp on his work using recurring themes, camera techniques, and an overbearing sense of dark irony. In that regard, Dr. Strangelove is the first point in Kubrick's filmography where everything coalesces into what is unmistakably a Kubrick film.
In order to guard against surprise nuclear attack, America's Strategic Air Command maintains a large force of B-52 bombers airborne 24 hours a day.
Certain storytelling techniques, like the omniscient narrator speaking in the third person, or favoring one-point perspective in his compositions, are present throughout Dr. Strangelove and point to Kubrick's decidedly unique worldview. However, it's in the exploration of the duality of sex and violence that the director's mark is made truly apparent. The film explores the idea of violence as a response that ultimately stems from sexual frustration. All the characters in Dr. Strangelove are sexually frustrated in one fashion or another. General Ripper equates the male orgasm in intercourse with losing his essence.
Women sense my power, and they seek the life essence. I do not avoid women, Mandrake.
Yeah.
But I do deny them my essence.
Yes.
General Buck Turgidson is caught in a distracting, schoolboy-esque affair with his secretary.
Tell you what you do. You just start your countdown, and old Bucky will be back here before you can say, blast off!
Dr. Strangelove is obsessed with the morbid idea of playing a central role in repopulating the Earth with a bevy of beautiful women in the aftermath of a nuclear war.
With the proper breeding techniques and a ratio of, say, 10 females to each male, I would guess that they could then work their way back to the present gross national product within, say, 20 years. I hasten to add that since each man will be required to do prodigious service along these lines, the women will have to be selected for their sexual characteristics, which will have to be of a highly stimulating nature.
Even the pilots in the B-52 are seen ogling Playboy centerfolds as they fly towards their target. The characters' sexual dysfunction bleeds over into their professional lives as leaders of the free world, and the relatively easy access to nukes makes for quick, convenient, and effective bluffs when their fragile egos are threatened.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Kubrick was well known for his brilliance at playing chess, and he draws the story of Dr. Strangelove as a game of chess writ large, where we are the pawns, beholden to the whims of our kings and knights who are too involved in their petty affairs to realize that they are actually court jesters instead. Dr. Strangelove was originally supposed to debut to test audiences on a very fateful day, November 22nd, 1963, the day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Naturally, this had a profound effect on such a politically charged film. The biggest casualty was Kubrick's original ending, which would have seen an epic pie fight break out in the war room, while George C. Scott exclaims that the president has been struck down in his prime after President Muffley takes a pie to the face. The film was delayed until January of 1964, where it was released to critical and commercial acclaim, as well as a Best Picture nomination at the Oscars. As the last black and white film that Kubrick would ever make, Dr. Strangelove's importance, not just to cinema but to 20th century history, cannot be overstated. The Library of Congress presumably felt the same way, selecting it as one of the first films to be inducted into the National Film Registry in 1989. No other film encapsulates the hopeless absurdity of the Cold War as perfectly as Dr. Strangelove, and as long as nuclear weapons continue to exist, squirreled away by the hundreds in hidden silos and ready to launch at the push of a button, Kubrick's blackly comic cautionary masterpiece will remain as relevant and important as ever.
But I know